With us tonight is a special guest to introduce Noam Chomsky. Bob McChesney is a UW Professor of Journalism. He has written 3 books dealing with media and democracy and hosts a bi-weekly talk show on WORT-FM. Professor McChesney is also active in several media activist groups and is an advisor and board member for a variety of nonprofit publications and broadcast stations. Before entering academia, he was the founding publisher of The Rocket, a Seattle rock magazine that is now the 3rd largest circulation rock magazine in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bob McChesney.
Well, thank you all for coming out to see me talk tonight. I've prepared a 2-hour address. Actually, the last time I spoke in this building, it was to one of these community group operations, and I think there were 2 people in attendance. So I think I'm moving up in class here. I don't know how many of you saw yesterday's Cap Times, but there was a interview with Noam Chomsky in it, conducted by John Nichols, and the headline was "Radical Democrat." Not a bad headline, Radical Democrat, referring to Noam Chomsky. And I thought that was an interesting title. What exactly is the difference between a radical Democrat and a Democrat? If you think about it, that's an interesting question. What are the core principles of democracy that Noam Chomsky adheres to that would qualify him as a radical Democrat or as a Democrat? Well, first of all, is the idea that people are capable of governing their own lives. People are capable of governing their own lives. Secondly, is the idea that we should respect individual freedom and the ability of people to live their life to the fullest. Third, a core tenet of democracy is the idea that we should understand the quality of an individual's existence is in direct relation to the quality of their social relations. That as long as anyone is oppressed, no one is free. That's a core principle of democracy. And finally, a critical aspect of democracy is the notion of equality. The notion that if one's race, gender, or class prevents them from full participation, a society cannot be democratic. Now, why is it that that's considered radical Democrat, not just Democrat? Why not just Democrat? Well, the reason for that, of course, is that the term Democrat and democracy has been twisted in our culture in an almost Orwellian manner. The status quo of democracy in this country is very far from the ideal. Instead of the principle of one person, one vote being the driving force, we have that as a formality, but in reality the driving principle in our democracy is $1, one vote. And those with the money are those with the most important votes. The most important value we seek to provide in this culture, this democracy, is not to encourage the full participation of individuals in the decision-making process, but rather the most cherished value is to protect private property so it can act as it pleases with minimal social obligation. And in a society where 0.5% of the population has more wealth than the bottom 90% of the population, it's clear that it's a type of democracy that looks awfully goofy by the principles I just mentioned. In our political culture, we see a deteriorating civic culture, a deteriorating physical environment, and a depoliticized, atomized, and demoralized population. The key decisions in our society are made by the few and for the few. Now, what I've just said explains why what Noam Chomsky does is a radical Democrat, not a Democrat, because that sort of democracy is precisely the opposite of what Noam Chomsky stands for. And it's worth noting that the type of democracy that I just referred to that exists today in the United States, of $1, one vote, is largely uncommented upon in our official culture. To our politicians, our pundits, too many of our academics, and certainly our mainstream media, this is democracy. This is what democracy is all about. It may not be perfect, but it's the best of all possible worlds. In Orwellian newspeak, and that's exactly what this is, capitalism equals democracy. Those policies that serve capital, that serve the wealthy, thereby automatically serve democracy, despite the transparent idiocy of such claims that we see around us every day. Not simply in the United States, but throughout the world. I've seen the statistic quoted. I don't know how accurate it is, but it doesn't stop me from using it. It's too good to pass up. That if you took the 100 wealthiest individuals in the world, the 100 wealthiest individuals who would probably fit in the first half of this theater, if even that, they would have as much wealth as the 1.5 billion poorest people in the world. 1.5 billion people. That's more people than live in all of the Americas. That's more people than live in Europe. That's 6 times the US population. How can you have a democratic society with that sort of inequality? Moreover, how can the very people pursuing policies to accentuate economic and social inequality claim to do so on behalf of democracy, which is what's happening in the world today? It's a truly Orwellian situation. Fortunately for us, though, tonight we will have a principal opponent of this world, Noam Chomsky, a true Democrat, a radical Democrat only because the way democracy has been warped in this current culture, in this current environment, a principled and honest man whose core value has always been tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may, without any sacred cows. I think for myself and for many people in this room, and certainly many people around the world, Noam Chomsky has been a teacher. He's probably been the most important teacher I've had, and I think it's true for so many people, of democratic values, of morality, and of intellectual honesty. Specifically for those of us who've chosen life in the academy, or who are intellectuals, he has been a central exemplar of how to behave and conduct ourselves. Don't take yourself too seriously, and certainly don't take the academy very seriously. And understand that the true heroes in this society and all societies are always the people whose names we'll never know. The people who are intellectuals, people at universities, people like ourselves have tremendous privileges, and we have obligations with those privileges, severe obligations that we have to undertake. And having said that, please join me in welcoming Noam Chomsky.
Getting my, is that working? Yeah. I've been asked to announce several forthcoming events, so let me start with that. If I get the facts wrong, blame it on the people who gave me the information. The campaign against the death penalty is having an informational picket in the Library Mall tomorrow and a meeting on Thursday. And if I understood the message that got to me correctly, there actually is an execution either tonight or tomorrow night. The Alliance for Democracy is awaiting with bated breath a decision from the regents on March 7th, and I presume there's some action associated with that on the matter of socially responsible investment board for the university and specific question of divestment from Burma. Next March 13th at 7:30 at the Press House Chapel, if I'm reading it right, there's a talk by 2 personal friends, Constancio Pinto and Matthew Jardine, on the struggle for an independent East Timor. Constancio was Timorese resistance figure who was captured and tortured by the Indonesians and escaped, and Matthew's done a lot of important writing on this. I think that's what I had, so that's the information. When any thesis about important human affairs is proclaimed with great unanimity and confidence, a rational person will at once become skeptical. If only because so little is understood about such matters. When the odes are chanted, by people who benefit from the doctrines that are proclaimed, skepticism naturally advances a few notches higher. That's not enough to demonstrate that something's amiss, but at least it raises some obvious questions. And that's pretty much what I'd like to do. I would like to raise a few questions about some of today's leading mantras. The main theme of general social and political discourse these days has to do with the triumph of market democracies. That's supposed to be the result of America's victory in the Cold War. That was a victory for fundamental principles, the principles of democracy and the principles of the free market. This is proclaimed in rousing rhetoric, which is frequent enough so I don't have to bother quoting it. There's a name for the resulting principles, especially on the market side. They're called sometimes the Washington Consensus. Outside the United States, it's called neoliberalism. The neoliberal Washington Consensus is the expression of this victory of principle in the free market domain, and with it goes the victory of democracy. A leading principle of neoliberalism is what's called minimizing the state, that is, reducing the arena in which decisions fall, theoretically at least, are subject to democratic participation. That means shifting democratic decision-making power somewhere else. When you minimize the state, you maximize something else. So decision-making power is transferred. Well, where is it transferred to? The doctrine tells us it's transferred into the hands of the people, who are now liberated from the talons of the democratic state. The reality, I think, is a bit different, and I'll return to that, merely noting right off that there's a certain tension between the two principles that are held to have emerged triumphant, according to standard doctrine, the principle of expansion of markets and expansion of democracy. When we look more closely, we find that that tension mounts further. So let me give you a few illustrations, concrete ones from right now. So let's start with a headline in the New York Times, page 1 headline a couple of weeks ago. Headline reads, "United States is exporting its free market values." The story has to do with the World Trade Organization agreement, which, according to the agreement, signatories are opening their telecommunications systems to foreign enterprises, with U.S. corporations, giant corporations, very well positioned to take over a good share of international telecommunications. Going on with the story, the agreement, I'm quoting it now, the agreement brings American-style competition to other countries. They must now adopt American values, our passion for free markets without state interference, which is illustrated most dramatically by telecommunications, the internet and information technology, the wave of the future, thanks to rampant individualism freed from state intervention and the traditional American values. A kind of side comment in the article points out that the agreement opens up new forms of intervention into the internal affairs of other countries. They now have to modify their domestic laws and practices to permit the communication system to be taken over by foreigners, as of course will happen almost everywhere except here. A communication notice, opening up communication to external control, is not quite the same thing as, say, giving away your automobile industry, where there's some pretense of democracy, at least. Communications is at its heart. So concentration of control over communications in any hands, particularly in foreign hands, at least raises some questions about meaningful democracy. Just as, for example, concentration of finance in any hands, particularly foreign hands, raises some questions about any hope of popular involvement in social and economic planning, which is another dimension of democracy. And similarly, concentration of control over food, let's say, in any hands, but particularly in foreign hands, raises some rather serious questions about survival, a point that was made by the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, about a year ago when it warned third world countries not to permit their food supplies to be controlled by international agribusiness because it could be extremely dangerous to even to their survival for obvious reasons. Control over finance, control over food is well underway. That's pretty far advanced. And a major achievement of neoliberalism is to increase it around much of the world. The next major target is liberalization of financial markets, which means the takeover of the global economy, and that means national economies, by huge financial giants and investment firms, again, mostly American. Once again, there's some tension among the various principles that are supposed to have emerged victorious. Further tensions arise when we look again a little more closely. So the same day that the front page of the New York Times announced the victory of our passion for free markets, as illustrated by telecommunications and the internet and so on, the same day an editorial in the New York Times warned the industrial world not to turn to the World Trade Organization to rule on the Helms-Burton Act, which penalizes foreign investors in Cuba, effectively closing the American market to them, which is no small thing, puts them out of business for the most part. The editors, the people who wrote the editorial, they accept the general assumption that the World Trade Organization would rule against the United States. That is, it would rule U.S. actions to be in violation of free trade. The free trade agreements. So the conclusion, the logical conclusion is that the World Trade Organization should not be allowed to rule. That's the way we express our passion for free markets. The United States has since refused participation, so the issue is moot. I mean, if like some small country refuses participation, it doesn't matter, you go ahead anyway. But if the United States refuses it, the game is over. That's pretty standard. You'll remember about 10 years ago, the United States was brought to the World Court on the charge of illegal economic warfare and international terrorism, and it was clear that the World Court was going to rule against the United States, so the United States refused jurisdiction and essentially destroyed the issue. There was actually a ruling, but it's on paper, barely even reported here, which accused the United States of the unlawful use of force, which means international terrorism, and illegal economic warfare, that means violation of the trade agreements against Nicaragua, and ordered reparations, you know, the consequences of that. So this is standard. The conclusion from all of this is pretty straightforward. You don't have to be a big logician to figure it out. Intervention in the core domestic policies of other countries is fine when it has to do with such innocent matters as control of their food supplies or their finance or their communication systems, and, small footnote, when U.S. enterprises are going to end up controlling it, that's fine. But it's unacceptable when the United States doesn't like the outcome. That's what's known as the passion for free markets and democracy. In the case of Nicaragua, to give you some more unpublished material, I mean, you know, published in legal journals, when the United States rejected the World Court's claim, the United States not only rejected the World Court decision, but it also went on to veto a Security Council resolution calling for all states to observe international law. It didn't mention anybody, but everybody knew who it meant. The General Assembly, you can't have a veto, so when it came to the General Assembly, as it did for several years, the United States voted alone, sometimes with one or two client states, against the whole world on the question of whether states should observe international law. I mean, that was considered so marginal, it wasn't even reported. And there was a reason. In the case of Nicaragua, the reason was that the United States said that well, here's the actual wording of the State Department. It said we must reserve the right to use force in self-defense, in this case, self-defense against Nicaragua. Furthermore, it pointed out that when the United States joined the World Court back in 1945, the United Nations and the World Court was a reliable instrument of justice. The reason was that at that time, this is what the State Department response says, at that time, the United Nations and most of the world pretty much followed the U.S. lead for kind of obvious reasons, if you think what the world was like in the late 40s and who was starving and so on. But over the years, the United Nations has extended, all this kind of decolonization has taken place. There's all kind of strange people, funny colors and so on around there. I mean, this isn't the wording now. Anyhow, the United Nations has changed, and it no longer reliably follows the U.S. lead. And members of the United Nations often oppose U.S. stands on things, and they don't accept U.S. decisions. As a result, the World Court simply isn't a reliable instrument of justice anymore, just as the UN is not a reliable instrument of decision-making. And therefore, in addition to our right to use force in self-defense, the United States refused to accept the jurisdiction of the court with virtually unanimous approval inside the United States and virtual silence on the facts. Just to mention a small footnote, those of you who followed carefully the war against Nicaragua that continued to go on, in fact, it was Democratic Congress. The Democratic Congress immediately stepped up the war with new funding instantly after the World Court condemned the U.S. for unlawful use of force, and that continued. We went on providing what was called humanitarian aid universally. It was called humanitarian aid. I have never seen one mention of the fact that the World Court specifically ruled on that question in 1986 and determined that all aid going to Nicaragua under the Contras, under international law, was military aid. There was no humanitarian aid. But that's just the World Court, and they're not a reliable instrument of justice. Just as the World Trade Organization is not a reliable instrument in this case because it's going to rule the wrong way. In the present case, in the case of the World Trade Organization, the refusal to accept World Trade Organization jurisdiction, the United States claims what is called a national security exemption. The idea is that our existence is at stake in the strangulation of the Cuban economy, so therefore World Court isn't entitled to rule on this matter, because it is true that when a country's existence is at stake, it's considered not subject to World Trade Organization agreements. Polite people are not supposed to remember, so please shut your ears at this point. Polite people are not supposed to remember the response of the Mexican ambassador when John F. Kennedy asked Mexico to join an earlier stage of U.S. terror and economic warfare. The ambassador declined, saying that if Mexicans were to argue that Cuba threatened its security, 40 million Mexicans would die laughing. So therefore they couldn't go along. He was sorry. Here, more educated folk are more sober, so fortunately, you can say national security exemption and all the readers of the press don't die laughing. The beneficiaries of a good education may not even see anything odd about the official Clinton administration statement, which kicked the World Trade Organization into the wastebasket. Here it is, Stuart Eisenstadt. He said, Europe, which brought the issue to the World Trade Organization, Europe is challenging 3 decades of American-Cuban policy, going back to John F. Kennedy, aimed at forcing a change of government in Havana. And obviously it's our perfect right to force a change in that government by violence and economic strangulation. So therefore, for them to challenge what is obviously our perfect right is intolerable, and of course we therefore can't accept this. Well, if you read the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, you read that, and I hope you didn't die, evidently you didn't die laughing, so that was okay. Actually, his history is not very good. It wasn't back to the Kennedy administration, it was back to the Eisenhower administration. It was in March 1960 that the United States made a formal decision in secret, now declassified, a formal decision to overthrow the government of Cuba. March 1960, for those of you who remember, there was no Russian connection. Castro was anti-communist, so that had nothing to do with it. But that's our right. And in fact, if you really know anything about the history, you'll know that it didn't start in 1960 either. It goes back to the 1820s. And in fact, the earliest foreign policy issue in the United States, involving the nice guys this time, like Thomas Jefferson and so on, was how to extend U.S. power to Cuba, that is, to overthrow any regime there. We weren't able to do it at the time because there was a deterrent, namely the British fleet. But by the time, the same reason the United States never was able to conquer Canada, to its regret. We did invade Canada several times, 1775 and on, but the British were too big in those days. So therefore, we'd have to wait, as John Quincy Adams put it, until Cuba drops into our hands like a ripe fruit by the laws of political gravitation, which finally happened, and then a couple of months after it made the mistake of trying to liberate itself, the Eisenhower administration officially determined to overthrow the government. We've been at it for 30 years, and for Europe to challenge this right is obviously intolerable, so therefore we express our passion for free markets by kicking the World Trade Organization out of this one. We're also not supposed to, there's actually a little more to this story. I'll add a few little items since Bob brought up the question of intellectuals. There's a leading American historian, liberal historian, Arthur Schlesinger, who actually criticized what he calls his friend Stuart Eisenstadt for the comment that I just quoted, so it's not fair to say there was no criticism. This is in a letter to the Wall Street Journal. Schlesinger writes that President Kennedy, he was one of Kennedy's advisors on Latin America and specifically on Cuba, and he says, writing from this position, he knows that President Kennedy's view was that that there would be a possible rapprochement with Cuba as if Fidel Castro receded from the Soviet connection and stopped troublemaking in the hemisphere. And now that's happened, so it's kind of out of date. Well, there's a little amnesia there. The documents for that period have just been declassified, and we know what Arthur Schlesinger was writing to President Kennedy when he was reporting to him in early 1961 about the reports of the Latin American study missions that he was heading. And he did discuss the problem of Castro. The problem is the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into one's own hands, which is a big problem when the poor and underprivileged, stimulated by the example of the Cuban Revolution, are now demanding opportunities for a decent life. That's the troublemaking in the hemisphere that worried Schlesinger and Kennedy and American liberalism generally. As for the Soviet Union, the connection was that that it all became a bigger problem with the Soviet Union presenting itself as a model for achieving modernization in a single generation. And obviously with that kind of threat to our existence, We had to overthrow the Cuban government. So that's not quite the same as what he's now saying, and it wasn't the Kennedy administration, it was earlier, but we're supposed to forget all that. We're also not supposed to remember some more recent things. For example, that a few months ago, the Clinton administration slapped prohibitive tariffs on Mexican tomatoes at a cost of close to $1 billion a year for Mexican producers. That also violates World Trade Organization rules and also NAFTA rules. And there was an official reason. The official reason was that Mexican tomatoes are cheaper than Florida-grown tomatoes, and American consumers prefer them. That's it. I'm not making it up. The free market was working, but it was coming out with the wrong outcome. I don't think, as far as I'm aware, that it was claimed that Mexican tomatoes are a threat to national security, but maybe that was true too. I don't know. Anyhow, all of that stuff we're not supposed to notice, and that's kind of fair in a way. It's really fair to overlook little details like this when celebrating the triumph of the American passion for free markets in the case of telecommunications, because these really are minor footnotes in comparison with the real story. And the real story is not very obscure. The telecommunications industry, the whole business, is a kind of textbook example of radical violation of the free market. It's a textbook example of decisive state intervention, which virtually created the whole industry, sustaining it by large-scale, massive, in fact, transfer of public resources to private profit. Actually, there was a corporate contribution at one point, but that's when there was a monopoly, and at that point it was possible for AT&T to disregard market forces and contribute, but after that it's straight government subsidy virtually all the way, and that's pretty much across the board. That's from the early 1960s, but particularly in the 1980s, DARPA, which is the Pentagon Research Agency, DARPA was playing a leading role in developing the new technologies that gave the U.S. companies their commercial lead. That includes both hardware and software. It includes things like time sharing, networking, which is the core of the internet, advanced microprocessor design, parallel processing, on and on. The internet itself is just the ARPANET. It's the military net kind of converted to, by now, converted into the hands of big corporations, but for a while public use. And this is not to speak of, say, the satellites or the fiber optics and the semiconductor industry, which was saved from complete destruction by Reagan state intervention, which actually broke new records. Without going on, if all of this stuff demonstrates our passion for free markets, then they are strange creatures indeed, but you're not supposed to notice any of that. Actually, this extends pretty broadly, even to pretty minor things. Let me mention just one because it happens to involve the University of Wisconsin, and I'm sure you all read it. It was a front page story in the New York Times yesterday. There was a story it was about sheep cloning. Apparently here they do cow cloning, not sheep cloning. So the University of Wisconsin got into this huge story, 3-page spread. And the headline over the section involving this university reads, private enterprise puts up the money. They're really nice guys when you think about it. Then if you bothered to read the story, you notice that it says that the details say the opposite. They say that public resources put up the money all the way through, as far back as you go, up to even past the point where they were starting to get commercially viable drugs. And then when finally private enterprise realized that there's profit to make here, they picked up the money. They didn't put up the money. They picked up the money, and now they're trying to get into it with government assistance, incidentally. So that's the public put up the money, and that's the way the system works. This is a tiny example. Telecommunications is a huge example. This one happens to be close to home, but it was yesterday's paper, but it's very broad. Let me stress that this picture of our passion for free markets is not confined to the New York Times and others who like it, who hail the success for U.S. corporations, or as they prefer to put it, the triumph of traditional American values, which may in fact be the same thing. But it's also hailed by critics, way over to the critical side. So let's again take something right here, one of my favorite magazines, The Progressive. In its March 1997 issue, the one that's just out, there's a review of a book by Robert Kuttner that warned, I'm quoting it now, the book warns against giving society over whole hog to free markets, though the author, while warning about this, knows he is writing into the wind. Republicans and Democrats alike are now fully dedicated to free markets without government interference, to what the Times calls American values. Well, I just gave a couple of examples. Let me stress there is an important kernel of truth buried in that picture, but it's only a very small part of the story. And it's extremely misleading to describe what's happening in those terms. The history of the telecommunications industry, or even the sheep, at the other end of the scale, is the rest of the story, and it's a very big story. Let me give an example from a mainstream liberal journal. This is about a year ago, from the New Yorker. Their good economics correspondent, John Cassidy, he had a useful article reviewing the travail of the middle class, the kind of article you've read a lot of, and what he calls the unprecedented redistribution of income toward the rich in the past 20 years, which has harmed those who are left behind, the considerable majority of the population, in fact. The typical American family is actually worse off than in the mid-90s than it was in the late 70s. The details are actually pretty dramatic. The major study of this, if you're interested, is a book called The State of Working America. It comes out every 2 years. The 1996-97 issue just appeared. It concludes that higher profitability and CEO pay may be the only payoff or concrete sign of accomplishment from 16 years of transition to a more deregulated economy. Notice, not a more free market economy, because it isn't. This has a spillover effect for the very top of the income distribution, but for everyone else, it's suffering. Well, the New Yorker article kind of goes through that, reviews some of this, and it concludes that it's kind of a sad story, but it's nobody's fault. It is just how capitalism has developed. It's what the free market has decided in its infinite and mysterious wisdom. And politicians will have to accept the fact, recognizing that nothing could be done about what are virtual laws of nature. So we can have democratic forms if we like, but we have to understand that their reach is very narrow. They can't make, the sun go off into a different direction, and they can't make these forces go in any different way. It's out of our hands. The democratic forms are, and that limit of democratic forms is in fact everywhere now that the whole world is adopting the traditional American values, our passion for free markets imposed through the Washington Consensus, the free trade agreements, and the new and more efficient modes of intervention in the affairs of others, deep internal affairs of others, that's now possible, though selectively, not mentioned. Well, again, if you take a closer look, you learn more about the relation between reality and the doctrinal system through which it's filtered. So the article tells us what the free market has decided in its mysterious wisdom, but it doesn't say anything much about the business enterprises that somehow are involved in all of this in some equally mysterious way. Actually, it does mention 3 corporations, the article. They are McDonnell Douglas, Grumman, and Hughes Aircraft. Each of them, again, a textbook example of massive state intervention in the economy in radical violation of our traditional passion for free markets. In fact, they illustrate very well the traditional operative values, which are that cost and risk should be socialized, but profit should be privatized. That's the passion. That's what we call free enterprise. And the three examples chosen to illustrate the mystery of the market illustrate it very nicely, just as telecommunications does. And just as, say, the most valuable company in the Fortune list last year, General Electric, very similar history, or for that matter, President Clinton's choice, when he preached what the New York Times called the gospel of free markets to much acclaim at the APEC meeting, the Asia Pacific Economic Conference meeting in Seattle, where he laid out what he called his grand vision of a free market future. The gospel was preached in the Boeing terminal, and Clinton gave Boeing as the prime example of the gospel, which makes a certain sense. It's the leading exporter in the country, big markets in China and Saudi Arabia and so on. It's now one of two global corporations that produce civilian aircraft. The other is Airbus. Both Airbus and Boeing are beneficiaries of decisive state intervention from their origin. They wouldn't exist otherwise, and maintained that way. That includes direct subsidy, sometimes indirect subsidy, as for example when commercial jets borrowed the technology that's developed in the state sector, meaning military production, very standard and quite important. So the mystery of the market is really mysterious if the examples that are chosen to illustrate it are typical, as indeed they are. Well, let me return to some further illustrations of the current scene. I will in a moment, but kind of a sidetrack a little bit to give a little historical perspective into all of this, which I think is helpful for understanding the telecommunications agreement and, in fact, the whole story about the wisdom of the market. So I want to talk about this in two phases. First of all, since World War II, and then a few remarks, much too brief because it's interesting and important from further back. They basically tell the same story. And I'd really like to encourage, this isn't going to be comprehensive, so I'd like you to encourage people to look into it. I think you'll learn a lot. So let's look at the story since World War II. Well, as you know, right before World War II, the country was in a big depression. The New Deal came along, had virtually no effect, smoothed off some of the rough edges, but it was about as bad in 1939 as it had been at the beginning. Then World War II came along, and that got us out of the depression. In World War II, there was a kind of a semi-command economy, pretty much very strong state intervention, controlling resource allocation and holding down wages and all sorts of other things, making production decisions, and that worked. The American economy boomed, the Depression was over, industrial production more than tripled. It was a smashing success, led to an enormous growth of the economy, and a lesson was taught about how to maintain something vaguely like a capitalist economy, have massive state power control and direct it in the proper fashion. And furthermore, the lesson was taught to exactly the people who were in a position to learn something from it, namely to the corporate managers who flocked to Washington to run the semi-totalitarian wartime economy. They learned what later came to be called the message of Keynes, and they just learned it from practice. Actually, I'm mostly quoting now from the leading American business historian, Alfred Chandler, who's one of the people who's written about this. Right after the war, for obvious reasons, there was a lot of concern that we'd go right back to the Depression. In fact, there was a consensus. It extended all the way from the economists, like, say, Paul Samuelson and a young economist, over to business leaders. They took for granted that if these measures of massive state intervention were withdrawn, we'd head right back to the Depression, which seemed quite reasonable. And if you read the business press in the late 1940s, it's full of discussion of this. So Fortune magazine pointed out that high-tech industry cannot survive in an unsubsidized, competitive, free enterprise economy, and the government must be the savior, Business Week added, and other business press continued in that refrain, as did the economists, which made much sense, just looking at the recent history and the lessons. Well, the business world understood, as well as do the people who teach you, first semester of economics, that there are a lot of different ways in which the government can stimulate the economy. I mean, military spending is one way, but social spending is another way, and hiding dollars in the sand is another way, and all the stuff you learn about. Any of those ways will work, and they understood it perfectly well without taking economics courses. And in fact, there's a discussion, an interesting discussion, in the business press. This is all public, you don't have to go to the classified documents. In the business press in the late 40s about what to do. Main question is, should we have social spending or military spending to stimulate the economy? And they very quickly hit upon military spending as the optimal method. And there were some good reasons for that. The problem, social spending has a kind of a downside, several defects. One defect is it's not a direct gift to corporations. It only kind of leaks to them indirectly. Another is it has a democratizing effect. So if you're going to build hospitals and schools and things like that, people have opinions, and that gets them interested in involving themselves in a democratic process, and that's kind of the wrong sort of thing. Thirdly, it has a redistributive effect, tends to redistribute income to the general population. So it's got a lot of problems. Military spending has none of these defects. It's a direct gift to corporations. It's anti-democratic. Nobody has an opinion on what kind of jet plane to build. You just listen to guys. And it's redistributive, but upwards. So it's highly advantageous as compared with social spending. Now, economics texts don't go into that. That's somebody else's department. But in the real world, that matters. So they quickly decided that military spending would be the right way. Military spending has a further advantage. It's extremely easy to sell. And the method was understood. Truman's first Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, a good New Deal liberal, he pointed out that, as he put it, the word to use is not subsidy, the word to use is security. That's the way you sell the subsidy. And you can do that with military spending if you have people frightened enough, and in fact there's lots of ways to get people frightened right up till today, like national security doctrines about Cuba, maybe Mexican tomatoes, who knows. But it's not that hard a job, which is why nobody laughs when we talk about our national security being at stake when somebody tells us we can't violate trade agreements with Cuba. So that was perfect. Military spending had all the right advantages, quickly hit upon. It quickly became international, what some have called international military Keynesianism. That's pretty much what stimulated and revitalized the economies of the industrial world. Japan and Europe, after the Marshall Plan, which was not pretty much of a failure, but the huge military spending that did give them a huge shot in the arm. The Vietnam War gave them another one, and so on. South Korean takeoff, for example, dates essentially from the Vietnam War for those reasons. Well, by 1948, the business press was hailing, I'm quoting, hailing Truman's Cold War spending as a magic formula for almost endless good times. It's a way to inject new strength into the entire economy. By 1952, still quoting, it was obvious that foreign economies, as well as our own, are mainly dependent on the scope of continued arms spending in this country, serving as a cover for public subsidy to advanced sectors of industry. I'm quoting Steel Magazine and the Magazine of Wall Street, but this is rather general in the business press and understandable and correct. And so the story continues right to the present. So let's say take computers, which are kind of like the core of a modern industrial economy. In the 1950s, they were big, clunky things. People my age will remember. You couldn't sell them to anybody. I mean, vacuum tubes are always blowing up, and the programming papers all over the house and that sort of thing. So it's, in fact, all over the factory. It was very impossible to sell. So the public paid 100% of the cost of development under the guise of an air defense system. That's actually run by my university. I don't think anybody working on it thought it was going to block anything but, you know, maybe a World War I plane that got off course somehow. But it did develop the major architecture for contemporary computers, the software and so on. By around 1960, some of the people working on it realized that these things are going to be marketable, pulled out, formed first Dell, which was the first big commercial computer company, then IBM got in the act and others. And by the 1960s, you had sort of marketable mainframes, and the public contribution reduced from 100% to about 50%. By the 1980s, there was a new wave of computer development, fifth-generation computers, parallel processing, all kind of fancy stuff, so the public share increased again. In fact, Star Wars was largely a cover for this, and was sold to the business community that way, I should say. Well, what's true of computers is in fact true of just about every dynamic aspect of the contemporary economy, usually under the cover of security as when you mean subsidy. That includes, obviously, the aeronautical industry. It's not worth discussing that one. Automation was so inefficient, it had to be developed in the state sector for several decades, things like containerization by the Navy and other kinds of automation by the Air Force and so on, finally handed over to private industry when you could make profit on it. Machine tools are a striking case. That one's happens to be very well studied in important work by David Noble. The energy corporations, again, not worth discussing, so obvious. Biotechnology, pharmaceutical industry, I mean, you run through the list and you find pretty much the same story. And in fact, it runs through pretty much whatever's dynamic in the economy. Incidentally, that also includes services. One of the most profitable, maybe the most profitable service industry in the United States is actually tourism, which is a huge industry. And that's aircraft-based, remember. And since the aircraft industry itself is just an offshoot of public subsidies, so are the service industries related to it. And so it goes across most of the economy. And so these are not topics that are studied very much. They don't really fall within economics, you know, because economics is interested in abstract models of a free market and so on. They don't fall within political science because that's interested in like electoral behavior and things like that. So when you if you look at most university curriculums, this is not a topic, you know, and there's very little specific literature about it. You have to look at technical studies on particular things like the history of the computer industry and so on. The kind of place where these things are very well known, I should say, are places like where I work, MIT. And the reason is because MIT is part of the funnel through which public subsidies go to private profit. So like I'm in an electronics lab and got in the 1950s when 85% of the funding for electronics was coming from the public, mostly through the Pentagon, like my salary, and nobody could fail to understand this. The other place where it's understood is in business schools. So, you know, you'll get a study in the business school which will talk about how it works. But it's kind of not part of the general culture. You know, it's just like not happening. Nobody really looks at it. Well, it's not uniform. There are variations. So, for example, take, say, the Reagan years, 1980 to 1990 roughly. They were extreme in their contempt for markets, in practice, that is, not in public, of course. The public rhetoric of the Reagan administration, which was directed to poor people here, most people here, in fact, and to the third world was praise for the miracles and wonders of the market. You heard lots of that. To the business world, the message was a little bit different. So, for example, Secretary of Treasury James Baker, when he was speaking to a business audience, boasted publicly that the Reagan administration had introduced more protectionist measures than any post-war administration, any administration since World War II, which was true but much too modest. In fact, they introduced more protectionist measures than all post-war administrations combined, as they doubled the barriers to imports through various devices, amounting to tariffs in effect, raised it from about 12 to 23%. And that was very, meanwhile pouring huge subsidies into American industry, public subsidies. That was what a lot of the spending was about and a lot of the big debt came from. And that goes across the board. If market forces had been permitted to operate, it's very unlikely that the United States would have today a steel industry or an automotive industry or machine tools or semiconductors, telecommunications, and so on. Aircraft, we don't have to even talk about. That's basically an offshoot of the military. So that was unusual, and it's not a secret either. You can learn all about it in very mainstream sources. So, for example, Foreign Affairs, which has a review of the decade every decade, in their review of the 80s, they write that in the 80s, the Reagan years, the United States shifted from the world champion of unilateral free trade to one of its leading challengers, with the greatest swing toward protectionism since the 1930s. Now notice they're only talking about protectionism. That's omitting the huge public subsidies to high-tech industry, which led to the initiation of new technologies and startup companies and unprecedented public bailouts and a good deal more. If you look at scholarly studies of the predecessor of the World Trade Organization, GATT, which is what was functioning then, the major scholarly study of GATT by one of its main economists, GATT economists, estimates that Reaganite restrictions on free trade were about 3 times higher than any of their foreign counterparts. This, he points out, was part of the sustained assault on free trade principles by the industrial countries from the early 1970s. The reason is that that's when financial markets were opened by Richard Nixon's dismantling of the Bretton Woods Agreement, probably the most important change in the global order since World War II. Since time is short, I won't go into it, but it had enormous effects on the international economy, on restriction of democracy, and all sorts of things. If there's time, I'll talk later. Well, all of this stuff, so notice these are not secrets, what I'm saying. It's perfectly known that there was a massive assault on free trade principles with the United States leading the way, particularly in the Reagan administration, with enormous effects. It has major effects on the economy, and in fact, it's one of the prime reasons behind the unprecedented redistribution of income toward the very rich and the steady decline for the majority as we do move towards a society with a lot of the structural properties of the third world. The biggest winners in 1996, Business Week pointed out, are aerospace and defense, that is, state-subsidized industry, more than twice as high as any competitor, and the competitors, if you look at them, are also beneficiaries of the transfer of public funds to private profit in earlier years. And that continues. It's reported in the business press. Like you read the business press, they tell you about it, while the headlines up front are lauding the tradition of, the triumph of our passion for free markets and the traditional American values of free trade. For example, last November, in the business pages of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal is business pages. In the business pages, you could read that Japan had announced a new government program of around $1 billion a year to aid Japanese companies to regain the ground that they lost when the Reaganite programs, which had been disguised as military spending, saved U.S. companies and gave them a big lead in chip making, other related technologies, semiconductor industry. So now they're going to recover the ground with a new huge infusion of public funds. On the very same day, the Clinton administration announced a program to build new military jets, which it was estimated would run up to $750 billion of profit or more, not slight. They waited till after the election to announce this because you guys are paying for it. It runs to those huge figures when you take in foreign sales, which are the result of very aggressive government intervention themselves. There was a very interesting feature to this decision, apart from the huge scale. The interesting feature was that, and it was noticed, that McDonnell Douglas was excluded from the competition in favor of Boeing. Boeing had just won a $1 billion contract for a laser system for 747s. It's called a defense system. The reasoning for shifting from McDonnell Douglas to Boeing was McDonnell Douglas is a military plane maker. Boeing is mostly what's called commercial, means takeoff for military planes. The reasoning was explained by Pentagon officials and by aerospace industry analysts. The reasoning is that Boeing has essentially the American monopoly for commercial aircraft, and therefore new technologies have to go to it fast and directly to expedite the growth of commercial production. And the way we do that, of course, is under the cover of military spending, so it can't go indirectly anymore. We got to go directly to the commercial producer. That was described in the business press as a shift from a military-industrial economy, as it used to be called, to an industrial-military economy, where we don't conceal what's going on anymore. Now it's even clearer what it is. Industrial economy, subsidized by the public under the guise of the military. And in fact, one useful effect of the end of the Cold War is that it's much harder to maintain pretenses. So the clouds are kind of lifting, and a lot of things that were sort of hidden are now closer to public view. Well, all this talk about dazzling profits and that kind of business is a little bit unfair. It's worth mentioning that business has problems too, and they're discussed. So about a year ago, Business Week had a sad article with the headline, "The Problem Now, What to Do with All That Cash," as surging profits overflow the coffers of corporate America and profits are going out of sight. That was a bit of a problem. It's actually gotten worse. Last February 10th, Business Week had an article in which it lamented the fact that the liquid assets of non-financial companies had reached a staggering $679 billion, and that is causing what they called vexing problems at Boeing, IBM, Intel, Ford, and so on, because they really can't figure out what to do with that huge amount of cash. And remember, we live in kind of lean and mean times, so we have to put up with the fact that we have the highest poverty level in the industrial world, by far the highest level of child poverty, literal starvation, and all sorts of other third world maladies. And we got to do something about it, and we know what to do about it. The Clinton and the Republicans agree. We have to cut capital gains taxes to free up funds for investment, for the benefit of everyone, of course, because these staggering $2/3 of $1 trillion that are sitting there with nobody knowing what to do with them are causing vexing problems, and therefore they can't go to investment, so we therefore have to add to them. And the idea behind privatization of Social Security, which is one step away, is to add further funds to this staggering quantity, mostly going to money managers and people like that, so that maybe we can have better growth. Well, so there, life isn't easy, even in the business world. I should say that it takes a kind of a very well compartmentalized mind to be able to look at all of this, and not to either die laughing like the 40 million Mexicans or react in some other fashion. And it is a tribute to the educational system that all of this stuff is there, and somehow it passes us by. Well, let me go back a little bit and talk about some history before World War II, because that's also extremely revealing. Here I'll just barely mention some things, but suggest you look at them. If you go back to the 18th century, the differences between today's first world and today's third world were much less sharp than they are now. For example, India was the major commercial industrial center of the world in the 18th century. It was producing more iron than all of Europe, and high tech too. And as late as the 1820s, English engineers were going to India to learn how to make advanced steelmaking techniques and that sort of thing. In fact, now it seems from recent scholarship that wages in South Indian industry were actually higher than in English industry in those years in purchasing power, and working conditions were in fact better. It wasn't that they were producing because they had cheaper labor, as had often been thought, apparently. And that's just one dramatic example. I mean, obviously that's not the relation between India and England today. And the pattern is general throughout the first and third world. So that raises a couple of questions. One question is, which countries developed and which countries didn't? And the second question is, can we sort out some of the factors? Well, the answer to the first question is completely straightforward. We don't have to waste any time on it. The countries that developed were Europe and those who resisted European colonization. That means basically two: the United States, which did resist European colonization, and Japan, which was able to keep from being colonized. So they developed. Japan brought along a couple of its colonies in tow, what are now South Korea and Taiwan. Japan was a brutal colonial ruler, but it treated its colonies differently from the West. It developed them. So if you look at the development of Taiwan and was in Formosa and Korea, under Japanese imperial rule, it's about the same as Japan, in every respect. It's just different from the West. So that's the part of the world that developed, not much else. Leads to the question of what the factors were. Well, some of the reasons are pretty clear and well known and not argued about very much. They're summarized, for example, in a major review of the topic by a well-known, quite conservative economic historian, Paul Bairoche, in a book published by Chicago University Press recently. He points out the consensus that there is no doubt that the Third World's compulsory economic liberalism was a major element in explaining the delay in its industrialization, and in the very revealing case of India, the process, I'm quoting, the process of deindustrialization that turned the world's leading workshop and trading center into a deeply impoverished agricultural society with a very sharp decline in real wages, in food consumption, and availability of simple commodities, and so on. Notice that that's neoliberalism for the defenseless. That's the current Washington consensus, the doctrine we're supposed to worship for the defenseless, not for us. What about the successful societies? Well, actually here it isn't really well understood. So about 2/3 of U.S. growth in per capita output is unexplained, so specialists tell us. But some things are reasonably clear. One of them is that radical departure from free market principles was a significant factor, maybe decisive. As far as I know, that holds without exception from England up to the East Asian growth area today, dramatically, including the United States. So let's take us. How come we aren't still pursuing our comparative advantage in, say, exporting fur, which is what the principles tell us we should be doing? Well, like how come, say, we have a textile industry? Industrial revolution begins with textiles. Was it, say, that the textiles produced in eastern Massachusetts in the 1820s and 30s were cheaper and better than the textiles in England? No, it wasn't. They were worse and more expensive. But the United States had liberated itself and therefore was able to set up very high protectionist barriers and keep out the cheaper and better textiles from England. In other words, doing exactly what England had done to India. That's how it developed its own textile industry. And the result was that a textile industry developed in eastern Massachusetts with a lot of side effects. I mean, that means machinery and, carpentry and woodworking and all kind of things that grew up around the textile industry. Well, go on in the century. What about steel? How did the United States develop a steel industry? Was U.S. steel cheaper or better? No, it was worse. British steel was cheaper and better, but the United States set up very high protectionist barriers and also used the military system. So the great pacifist Andrew Carnegie was able to overlook his principles enough to get big naval contracts and, of course, to use state force to smash workers trying to strike and get wages and to hide behind high protectionist walls, and was able to set up U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation, and we got a steel industry. And so the story continues right until 1945. As Baruch puts it, the United States was the mother country and bastion of modern protectionism up to 1945. Again, the professional disciplines are designed in such a way that they don't really explain what was happening. They radically underestimate the role of the state in industrialization. And you can see this if you think about it a little bit. So protectionism was one factor, and that's the factor studied by economic historians overwhelmingly. But it wasn't the only factor. So the Industrial Revolution depended on cheap cotton, both in England and the United States. How was cotton made cheap and available? Like, was it market principles? No. It was by extermination of the native population in the southeast part of the United States and bringing in of slaves. Those are fairly serious violations of the market, but somehow that doesn't enter into the discussion when we talk about economic development and the marvels of the free market. Or take, say, the annexation of Texas and the takeover of a third of Mexico. What was the point of that? Well, we know, but that's studied in some other discipline, American history. The Jacksonian Democrats who carried this out were hoping to gain a world monopoly of cotton. President Tyler put it, if we annex Texas, it will place all other nations at our feet. In particular, it will place England at our feet, and remember, England was the great enemy because of its military force, which was constraining U.S. expansion. The Polk administration, with this having been achieved, said that the United States could now control the commerce of the world. It could command the trade of the world with inappreciable political and commercial advantages because of the fact that the United States, they hoped, had a virtual monopoly of the major commodity in world trade, namely cotton. Notice that the reasoning of the Jacksonian Democrats is exactly what was attributed to the Beast of Baghdad a couple of years ago. He was going to take control of the world's leading commodity and bring all nations to his feet, and so on and so forth. In that case, it was a fantasy, but a century and a half earlier, it was no fantasy, and it was a very significant part of how U.S. industrial development took place. Again, not exactly by market principles. A contemporary analog to that, in fact, is the energy industry. A very substantial part of the Pentagon budget is aimed at the Middle East, and its goal is to keep energy prices within a certain range. Not too high, because that'll harm the Western economies, not too low, because that'll cut into the profits of the energy corporations, which are mostly U.S. and partially British. so it's got to be kept in a range. There hasn't been much study of this. The only technical study I know is by an Energy Department consultant who concludes that the price of oil is underestimated by about 30% because of failure to calculate the part of the Pentagon budget that goes into keeping it that way. If that figure is anywhere near accurate, it means that the alleged efficiencies of trade are wildly off. They're way more, it's really way more expensive than is assumed, with all kind of other consequences about the economy. But again, this isn't the kind of topic you study if you want to get a job and that sort of thing. Well, as I say, factors like that are just not considered in economic history, past or present, and that leads to a very significant underestimation of the role of state intervention. Well, back in the 19th century, there were other cotton producers, not just the United States. India and Egypt were two major ones. India, you don't have to worry about. The British had smashed that one. What about Egypt? It's kind of hard to remember now, but in the early 19th century, Egypt was looked at as a potential powerhouse. Had a big, rich agricultural country. It was beginning its industrial development. It was barred. The British refused to allow independent development in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they had the power to block it. Foreign Minister Palmerston put it pretty bluntly. He said, "No ideas of fairness to Egypt ought to stand in the way of such great and paramount interests of Britain as maintaining a monopoly in that region." So, and they had the power to block it, so Egypt became what it is. Industrial development terminated. The United States, in contrast, which was, you could realistically compare to Egypt in those days and to India, the United States was able to follow the path of state-guided development, just like the mother country did, and it became what it is, rich industrial country. Later, Japan and its colonies did the same. Now, England did turn to liberal internationalism, to free trade, in 1846. That was after 150 years of protectionism and violence, and in fact the organization of Europe's most efficient developmental state with high taxation and so on. After all of that had led to double the per capita capitalization of any competitor. At that point, and other competitors like India were destroyed, so being way ahead of any competitor, the British discovered the wonders of a level playing field and went to liberal internationalism. You learn about that in school and how wonderful it was. However, there were some significant reservations. 40% of British textiles went to colonized India, and that was true of British exports pretty generally. Steel was later on British steel was priced out of international markets, but the colonies were still available, so you could send it to them in accordance with the principles of free trade. By the 1920s, Britain simply couldn't compete with Japan, which was more efficient and so on, so they just called the game off. The empire was closed to Japanese imports. That's a large part of the background for World War II. The Indian manufacturers did plead for protection, but from England, not from Japan, and that's not the way the game is played. In brief, the free trade game is fine if you're going to win. If that sounds familiar, it is. It's universal. So let's look at the United States. A century after England, the United States followed the same course, namely in 1945, again after 150 years of violence and radical market interference. The United States was far ahead of any competitor, in fact had half the world's wealth at the time. So again, like in England a century earlier, a level playing field looked like a nice idea if you're going to smash everybody, but again with reservations. So other countries were permitted only what was called complementary development, not the kind that would interfere with U.S. interests. That was true for Brazil, for Egypt, for India, and on and on. So like Brazil could have steel plants, but not high-tech steel of the kind we were producing. They could produce the low-end steel that we didn't care about. And we had the power to enforce that. There were also massive subsidies via the Pentagon system, which I've already discussed, and that's, of course, radical market violations. The same was true elsewhere, like agro-export. The United States, before Second World War, was producing about 10% of the global food exports, went to 50% by 1950. A lot of that was the result of direct state intervention through Tide Aid, what was called Food for Peace, and so on. I won't go into the details, but this is a good part of what lies behind the coca production in the Andean region today. Alternatives were simply wiped out by subsidized agribusiness exports. Interesting story, but another one. By the 1980s, the Reaganites basically called the game off, as I mentioned, and today the sectors that were helped to gain the lead are again, they have a passionate love of free trade. All of this is the relevant history of the telecommunications agreement. It may sound like a big story about one New York Times headline, but if you think it through, it's a story which is a parable of our times, including contemporary ideology. That's how it all works. The way it all works is no miracles of the market, but there is a law. Markets are kind of like democracy. They're fine if they come out the right way. Their markets are great if you win, just like democracy is okay if it comes out the right way, but otherwise it doesn't work, not allowed. That's what we might call really existing free market doctrine. It's very simple. Market discipline is good for you, but I need the protection of the nanny state. That's the doctrine. It's operative policy for the poor and the defenseless. Markets are wonderful. It teaches them responsibility, it's good for their character, all sorts of good stuff. For the rich and the privileged, on the other hand, you got to have a powerful state, welfare dependency, none of this market nonsense. Look at the Reaganite policies, makes it very clear. The current Democrat-Republican consensus is very similar, and in fact, it's about the story, and it goes back hundreds of years, including the attempt to cover it with a doctrinal framework that conceals what ought to be pretty obvious. Let me give a last illustration of this, very recent. Thomas Friedman, the leading commentator in the Times, had an interesting article in which he talked about how, the hawk-dove division, which used to hold, is it's not there anymore. Now, anyone who isn't totally mad is what he calls an integrationist, somebody who recognizes that globalization of the economy as it is proceeding is unstoppable. It's just the miracles of the market. And among the sane, they're kind of crazies, like, the Zapatistas who don't understand this, but anybody sane understands this. So keeping to the sane people, he says there are divisions between what he calls the safety netters and the let-them-eat cakers. The safety netter, the example he gives is Clinton, and maybe he was thinking of the recent welfare reform bill. The let-them-eat cakers, the example he gives is Gingrich. So he's the example of the integrationist let-them-eat caker. Well, that's a thesis. It's not a law of logic. It's an empirical claim. And you guys know that empirical claims are testable. So we can ask, is Gingrich an example of an integrationist let-them-eat caker? That can be tested. For example, Gingrich was in Congress in the 1980s when the Reaganites were conducting a massive assault against free markets for the benefit of the rich, who did indeed benefit. Now we can simply ask how he voted. Okay, you know the answer. He's certainly no integrationist. He's a radical anti-integrationist, anti-free markets. Is he a let-them-eat caker? Well, we can answer that question too. He represents a district, after all. He represents Cobb County, Georgia, a rich suburb of Atlanta, and he happens to have the championship for bringing federal subsidies to any suburban district in the country outside of the federal system itself. Like, there are two counties that beat him. One is Arlington, Virginia, which has like the Pentagon and half of Washington and so on. And the other is Brevard County, Florida, which is the home of the Kennedy Space Center, which is another device to pour public subsidies into advanced industry. If you move out of the federal system itself, he's the champion. That's what's called the let-em-eat caker. Somebody else let 'em eat cake, not our rich friends. In fact, the whole Atlanta region depends very heavily on public subsidies. The truth of the matter is that Gingrich is a leading advocate of really existing free market theory, that is, markets are great for third world peasants and 7-year-old kids. They have to learn responsibility, but not his rich constituents and the others like them. They need the nanny state. They got to be protected. The task of the doctrinal system is to conceal all of this so that the losers, the majority, will just accept their fate quietly, kind of forces of nature. We can't do anything about them. Stress, this is not the United States. It's entirely general. Just to give one illustration, there are some good studies of transnational corporations. The best one, by 2 British scholars, looks in close detail at the top 100 transnationals in the fortune list, and I won't go through the details, but it concludes that of the top 100, every one of them benefited from state industrial policy in its home country, and more than 20 were saved from complete destruction by takeover or total bailout by their home country. That's more than 20 out of 100. That includes, incidentally, Gingrich's favorite cash cow, Lockheed, which was saved by multi-billion-dollar loans under the Nixon administration. Well, return finally to neoliberalism and democracy and minimizing the state and all this business. I think if you look closely, you find it's all nonsense. There is an attempt to minimize that part of the state that is directed to public needs, and also to minimize the arena in which the public will be able to decide things. But there's an attempt to maintain and even extend the parts of the state that are serving private power, which in fact then, basically run the political system as well for obvious reasons. Secondly, there's an effort to transfer decision-making, but not to the people, but to private power, unaccountable private power. I should add, finally, that the corporations that increasingly dominate the international economy, they don't operate by market principles anyway, even apart from all the government support and interference. For example, just take, say, trade. What's called about more than half of U.S. trade actually isn't trade at all, except sort of meaningless terms. It's inside particular firms. So, like if Ford Motor Company transfers a part from Indiana to Illinois for adding some value, that's not called trade. But if they do it across to northern Mexico and then send it back, that's called trade. Although it's completely intra-firm, it's within a firm with all kind of mechanisms for violating market discipline, transfer pricing, and so on, and under the control of a very visible hand. These are like totalitarian institutions, and that's more than half of of U.S. trade. NAFTA's increased it, and it's well recognized in read the international trade literature. Well, the basic idea is that decisions over economic affairs and social and political life generally are to pass into the hands of private tyrannies, which are unaccountable and secret and sustained by the public through state power, which is restricted as much as possible to these ends under highly selective neoliberal principles. So the conflict between democracy and really existing markets that I mentioned at the beginning is quite real. Let me make a last comment just to raise a question. I won't try to answer it, about the socialization of risk and cost. There is a serious question. The question is how public funds should be spent. Should they be spent the way they are? How should public resources be used to lay the basis for the economy and the culture of the future? That's a real question, and it's not trivial. Second question is, should the results of all of this be handed over to private tyrannies to run without interference? And the third question is whether should the issue be discussed in the public arena? Is it a public issue? Who should decide these things? Well, there should be very little to debate, at least about the third, at least among people who think that democracy might be a good idea, but it's rejected. This is not discussed in the public arena. It's outside it, which tells you something about the state of democracy, something important. And it remains the case that the first, I don't think there should be any debate about the second question either. The first one, however, is a question of debate. There are serious questions about how public resources should be used to lay the basis for a viable life, but it's the public who should be deciding this, and it should not be assumed automatically that whatever the public pays for goes over to some private tyranny to run with strategic interactions among huge, sort of totalitarian institutions. About how the problems of the world should be addressed, there's plenty of room for disagreement. On the matter of manipulation and deceit to protect power from exposure, there should be no disagreement, again, at least among those who think that freedom and democracy might be good ideas. Thanks. The lights are such that I can't see anything very much, but I'm told that there's a microphone around there somewhere. Anybody know where it is?
Hello? Yes.
Over there?
On behalf of the distinguished lecture series of the Wisconsin Union Directors, I would like to thank Professor Chomsky for speaking this evening. There will now be a brief question and answer period for our lecture. People who wish to leave may do so now. People with questions for Professor Chomsky may line up directly behind him.
Are they going to be over there? Yeah. Can you pick up the questions okay? Can you pick up the questions? Yeah.
The forum for questions only for the purposes of further education. If you do have a statement for Dr. Chomsky, please address it in written form to the distinguished lecture series. The address is found at the bottom of all our literature. Your message will be relayed to the speaker. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming, Mr. Chomsky, to speak here. I am perhaps categorized alien, and I don't know what's the mean, but also my question is not going to be related what you were talking about, but also I do think democracy embraces media and politics. I was wondering why many universities have the law to say if you are not legally registered student, you will be kicked out from the classroom or you will be ticketed. And I don't think this is a democracy. And this country was based, or they came from Europe to find the freedom. But this is my own continent, and I was wondering if this is a democracy, if you are not allowed to educate yourself. It seems like it's no money, no knowledge.
So if I understood, the question is whether universities should simply be open to the public, period. That's what it comes down to. Personally, I think so. And in fact, insofar as individuals have a degree of power, and faculty do, they can do that. Like in my own case. My classes happen to be open to the public. I've been, for years, sort of had a kind of a battle with the MIT administration about this. They'd assign a small room depending on the number of students, and 20 times that many would show up, but they kind of gave up after a while. They figured they can handle one lunatic on their faculty. So by now I get a big room and anybody comes who wants to. But that's really not the answer. The question is, should it be a point of principle? In my personal view, yes, but that's like the last question that I asked. How should public resources be used to create the economy and the culture of the future? I don't think that's a trivial question, and I don't think that glib answers can be given. If you use them for one purpose, you're not using them for another purpose, and that has to be considered. My own judgment is like yours, okay, but I think that's a matter for real serious thought and debate. It's not for formulas.
Professor Chomsky, my name is Vanita Yadav, and I'm actually a student from a developing country interested in international trade. I've been reading a lot of opinion articles about the US public becoming more cynical, and I'm wondering if you would care to comment on what possible scenarios could emerge from that. Would you expect a more cynical public to turn away from politics, to turn away from foreign policy issues? Or the other scenario could be that since they're more cynical, they question it more, and hence they do get more involved in foreign policy issues. Or the third scenario could be that the population is really segmented. Mm-hmm. Now, if I were a foreign policy person from a non-US country and I was looking into this and I had an agenda, I wanted to canvass some issue, what sort of scenario would I be?
So let me see if I understood. What is the likelihood that the U.S. public, which is indeed becoming more cynical, there's no question about that, what's the likelihood it'll just turn away from questions like politics and foreign policy and so on? Is that the... Yeah.
That versus getting more involved.
Yeah. Well, look, you can't predict tomorrow's weather, right? To try to predict human affairs is totally hopeless. If you look at the record of predicting human affairs, it is, you might as well draw lots or something. It's a much too complicated business to predict. It's the kind of thing you try to do something about, you don't predict. If you look at past history, you can find all kind of analogies and differences. So, for example, take the United States. We've been through periods. This is not the first period of the kind we are now experiencing. I mean, it's never identical to what happened before, but there is a kind of a cycle. You look through history of the United States and England, the two most advanced societies, democratic societies since the early 1820s. There have been repeated periods which have been hailed, as the end of history, utopia of the masters. The people are driven down into apathy and cynicism. The guys who ought to own the place run everything. Perfection has been reached. The first such period was in England in the 1830s. Remember that the classical, Adam Smith was not the founder of what's called classical economics. He was pre-capitalist, he had all kind of weird ideas, someone will put him aside. But something like what's called neoliberalism is found in the work of Ricardo and Malthus and other economists of that period. And they had to teach a very hard lesson, a new lesson, new in human history. The lesson was that human beings have absolutely no value. Okay, they have no intrinsic value. That's new. If you go back to, say, feudal society, everybody had a place, maybe a lousy place, but a place. You had a right to a certain place in the society, and you belonged there, and the society somehow had a responsibility to keep you there, even if you were a slave. But there was a new idea coming along, post-Enlightenment, post-classical liberalism, post-Adam Smith, or Jefferson, and that was coming along in England roughly in the 1820s, and that was that people have no rights. They have only the rights that they can obtain in the labor market, period. If you can't get enough to survive in the labor market, then starve or go somewhere else. Now, in those days, you could go somewhere else. Like, you could go to the United States or Australia or Canada. And a little problem about some people living there, but that wasn't too serious. So that sort of meant something. That was the message. And that's not easy to teach people. It's kind of hard to drive out of people's heads this strange idea that human beings have some intrinsic rights, apart from what they can gain in the labor market. But it looked by the 1830s as if it had sort of won. It was written into the legislation, looked fine, and so on. There was only one small problem. The British Army was spending most of its time and effort putting down rebellions because people couldn't get it into their thick heads that they don't have any rights. So they did all kind of crazy things. They were mutinying and, strange things happening. And finally, something even worse happened. The idea started to spread that if we don't have any right to live, you don't have any right to rule, And that was serious. You started getting Chartism, and the labor movement started organizing, and it was all very subversive. And fortunately, the science, which according to Ricardo was equivalent to Newton's laws of gravitation, the science turns out to be kind of flexible. So it changed a little bit, and it suddenly turned out that, you have to have something like what later on is called social democracy. So there is a right to live, and you have to have a social contract, and so on. Okay, you go another 30, 40 years, say the 1880s, looked like the same thing was happening. Again, there was talk about perfection, finality, nobody has any rights, and so on and so forth. Again, the thing blew up. Same was going on in the United States. I won't go on with England, because they did establish a pretty stable social contract, which only changed very recently, in fact. In the United States, which had a much harsher history in this respect, the 1890s were a period of real violent repression of individual rights. They're called the gay 90s, and they were gay for some people, but not for working people in Western Pennsylvania, for example. I won't go through the history, but you ought to know it if you don't. And then it looked like utopia again. Okay, by the 1920s, it really looked perfect. There's an important book on labor history by the leading labor historian, David Montgomery, Yale University. It's called The Rise and Fall of the House of Labor. And the fall of the House of Labor that he's talking about is the 1920s. That's when labor was completely smashed. The leading figure in the labor movement, Eugene Debs, was in jail because he refused to recognize the nobility of Wilson's war. The unions were completely smashed. You couldn't have meetings. Very undemocratic. In fact, he calls it a very undemocratic America, but it looked like perfection, finality, end of history, wonderful. 10 years later, the whole thing blew up. You could ask the question you were asking could have been raised then. In fact, could have been raised in the gay 90s too, or the 1830s. Turned out 10 years later, the whole thing blew up. Workers are taking over factories. That's half a step before kicking out the bosses altogether and just running them. There was, the United States was forced into a kind of social contract called the New Deal. There was a big attack, huge corporate propaganda, big, fear and concern about this. By the 1950s, it looked like it was back in shape again. That was a period of quiescence, very little happening. People are cynical and apathetic, end of ideology, it was called in those days. 1960s, everything blew up again. By now we're into your lifetimes, you know what happened. And right after the 60s, the ferment of the 60s, again, the same story. An attempt to drive everybody back into their holes, narrow the sphere of democratic participation, put the wealth back where it belongs, into the pockets of the rich folk, and so on. And that carries us pretty much until today. Well, it's a repetition. It's not the first time. And furthermore, it's not just a cycle. It's a spiral that goes upwards. So you think about each one of these periods, you're better off than last time. So for example, now there's like a problem about defending Social Security and defending some kind of medical care for somebody, okay, let's say the elderly and the poor. That wasn't a problem in the 1920s because there was no Social Security and there was no medical care. In fact, even in the 1960s, there was no problem about defending medical care because there wasn't any. Okay, and if you look case by case, I think what you find is a gradual growth in, I don't know, I would call it's a value judgment, so I'd call it civilization. You call it whatever you like. But anyway, a pretty steady change in something, which is a recognition of some kind of intrinsic human rights. And you get it beaten down, and then you start again, but from a higher level. And I think we're at a higher level now than in ever before, you know, in these past cycles. So where's it going to go next? Your guess is as good as anyone else's. No one's ever been able to predict in the past. Nobody can predict now. You can just say that, yes, we're back in another familiar period, and it could lead to something like, you know, the movements of the 60s and the 30s, or it could lead to fascism. Nobody knows.
Just to shorten to that, do you think that the availability of the internet and the inability to control information flow will make a difference?
Will the, sorry, I didn't get that. I heard the internet, but will the ability to control information, will the internet, I didn't understand what you were asking about the internet. Could you ask again, please? Did anybody get it? I didn't hear it, no. Could you repeat the essence of the question, somebody? Will the availability of the internet make a significant difference? Well, I defer to my colleague and mentor, Bob McChesney, who's the world's leading expert on this topic, and he's right here, so he can answer it, except that I see he just walked out. Maybe didn't want to answer this question. Actually, I think he had to babysit, he told me, but maybe that's a secret. Whether the availability of the internet will make a difference depends on what the internet is. As long as the internet was part of the public system, meaning the Pentagon, which, remember, is a public, whatever you think about the Pentagon, it's a public system, then it was free. Okay, as long as it was the ARPANET, yeah, it was free. You could do anything you want. As it was sort of taken over by the National Science Foundation, still sort of within the public arena, it remained accessible. It's now being handed over to megacorporations. That's kind of the thrust of the Telecommunications Act of 1996 and a lot of other things. Bob actually has a book coming out on this, McChesney, which, along with other industry analysts, predicts that, plausibly, that the whole system, this is just going to be another huge public giveaway. I mean, a kind of privatization which, you know, makes what goes on in places like Brazil and Mexico look kind of trivial. A huge giveaway of public property to private power, which means unaccountable power, in which case, yes, it'll be an instrument of control, not an instrument of liberation. Now, the technology doesn't care, you know. Technology is mostly neutral. Like if you have a hammer, say, if you happen to hand it to a torturer, he can bash somebody's head in. If you hand it to somebody, a carpenter, they can build a house with it. You know, hammer doesn't care. And most technology is like that, including the internet. It could be a method of liberation, of information, of you know, education, bringing people together, and so on. It could be a way of creating what the public relations industry, huge industry, regards as the ideal society, as does the business world, namely a society based on a social unit which consists of you and the tube, and no more interactions among people, and you then with the tube in front of you, or whatever the technique is, maybe electrodes in your head or whatever they come up with next, you will be simply a passive consumer, subjected to creation of artificial wants, which you don't want, but you're made to think you want, lacking communication with other people, obedient, apathetic, cynical, all the power elsewhere. Could become that. And in fact, if it's in the hands of private corporations, there's every reason to expect that. In fact, they'd be crazy. In fact, probably they wouldn't even be acting legally unless they did that. That's their nature and their goal. So the question is who controls it. I don't think it's, there's nothing about, you can't tell from the internet itself what it means any more you can tell from a hammer, whether it's going to be used for a torture or for building a house. So that's something, again, to do something about, not to speculate about.
This will be the last question.
Recently, some Federal Reserve economists noted job insecurity and fear of job loss as a reason for not having to raise interest rates under conditions where other economic indicators would normally give the inflation red light. Last time you used the term domesticated aspirations. I was wondering if you thought that the insecurity and the formalization of American workers is actually creating conditions under which there isn't a necessity for state intervention to maintain the economic status quo.
Mm-hmm. I'm afraid I'm having a hard time hearing things through the mic. If you could say it without the mic, I'd probably hear you.
The whole thing?
You want to try again? Yeah.
Well, recently the Federal Reserve economists stated job insecurity and fear of job loss was the reason that they didn't have to raise interest rates under conditions that would normally red light inflation. Last night you used the term domesticated aspirations. I was wondering if you thought that the domesticated aspirations of American workers would create conditions that you could maintain the status quo with minimal state intervention.
Yeah, this has to do with some stuff that came up yesterday. I was quoting another article in the New York Times. So let me, for those of you who weren't there, I'll give you the gist of it. Last week, lead article talked about the revival of mourning in America. Mourning in America was that good stuff we had in the 1980s, you know, with Ronnie looking happy and the cowboys and all that stuff. And they said, well, ever since then, there's been a lot of gloom, and, you know, people are talking about, you know, poverty and inequality, but now there's a revival of mourning in America, and it goes into description of this. It says it admits that primarily it's among the wealthy and successful, like, you know, the top 2 or 3% of the population. Not too surprising, but the interesting thing is that there's also a revival of mourning in America among what the article calls the millions who are suffering, which is the huge majority of the population. There too, there's a revival of mourning in America. And what is it? Well, the revival of mourning in America is what in Salvadoran Jesuits, who I'd been quoting, call the domestication of aspirations by the culture of terror. One of the long-term effects of terror, they point out, is you just stop hoping. Kills hope. You don't even try. You figure there's no hope, I'll just accept anything. And they don't say that, but that's the proposal here. The idea is that it used to be the case, the article points out, that people had the idea that they could aspire to a better life. But now they've given up. Now people say, look, I know I can't make enough to get by, but it could even be worse. So I'll accept this. And that's the revival of mourning in America, so everything's looking up. It's very much like the culture of terror in Latin America. It's kind of like our civilized version of the culture of terror that we impose. Well, can that work? You know, will people really give up? Okay, will they accept the view that is hailed here, saying, I know I can't get by, but it could be worse, so okay, I'll just let it go. Same answers to the other questions. Nobody knows. I frankly doubt it. It's never happened in the past. People probably will not accept that. They may find a very destructive ways out. You know, there are a lot of ways of reacting to frustration and fear and, you know, recognition that nothing works and so on and so forth. Some of them are pretty ugly. Nazi Germany is an example, if you want one. And there are others that aren't very pretty either. Or it can be very constructive. And we just don't know. I mean, take, say, something like, to be concrete, take, say, the Oklahoma City bombing. Let's say that Timothy McVeigh did it as is charged. Okay, I'm not saying it's true, but suppose it's true for the sake of discussion. Just ask yourself, who's Timothy McVeigh? Just take a look at his background. You know, take a look at where he comes from. You know, what his possibilities are, and ask yourself, what was the counterpart to Timothy McVeigh doing in, say, the mid-1930s? Well, the answer is he was sitting in at the GM plant and helping construct the CIO and creating the social contract that did give people the aspirations that they could get ahead and live. Now, the genes haven't changed, but that same set of conditions and problems and fears can lead to wild, crazy actions, which are very destructive and harmful and could be a mass base for something like fascism, or it could lead to something very constructive, as it has in the past. And which way it goes depends on what people do. These are not topics for academic seminars. You can sit around in a philosophy seminar or an economics seminar or something and discuss them, but maybe that's fun, but the answer is nobody knows and nobody understands enough, and it doesn't make any difference what you decide anyway. These are things that have to be answered in the arena of actual life, action, participation, organizing, and so on. That'll determine the answer. Nobody can predict it.
The University of Wisconsin, and particularly the distinguished lecture series, would like to thank Dr. Chomsky for this.
Timorese resistance figure was captured and tortured by the Indonesians and escaped, and Matthew's done a lot of important writing on this. I think that's what I had, so that's the information. When any thesis about important human affairs is proclaimed with great unanimity and confidence, a rational person will at once become skeptical, if only because so little is understood about such matters. When the odes are chanted by people who benefit from the doctrines that are proclaimed, skepticism naturally advances a few notches higher. That's not enough to demonstrate that something's amiss, but at least it raises some obvious questions. And that's pretty much what I'd like to do. I would like to raise a few questions about some of today's leading mantras. The main theme of general social and political discourse these days has to do with the triumph of market democracies. That's supposed to be the result of America's victory in the Cold War. That was a victory for fundamental principles, the principles of democracy and the principles of the free market. This is proclaimed in rousing rhetoric, which is frequent enough so I don't have to bother quoting it. There's a name for the resulting principles, especially on the market side. They're called sometimes the Washington Consensus. Outside the United States, it's called neoliberalism. The neoliberal Washington Consensus is the expression of this victory of principle in the free market domain, and with it goes the victory of democracy. A leading principle of neoliberalism.
Don't take yourself too seriously, and certainly don't take the academy very seriously. And understand that the true heroes in this society and all societies are always the people whose names we'll never know. The people who are intellectuals, people at universities, people like ourselves have tremendous privileges, and we have obligations with those privileges, severe obligations that we have to undertake. And having said that, please join me in welcoming Noam Chomsky.
Getting my Is that working? Yeah. I've been asked to announce several forthcoming events, so let me start with that. If I get the facts wrong, blame it on the people who gave me the information. The campaign against the death penalty is having an informational picket in the Library Mall tomorrow and a meeting on Thursday. And if I understood the message that got to me correctly, there actually is an execution either tonight or tomorrow night. The Alliance for Democracy is awaiting with bated breath a decision from the regents on March 7th, and I presume there's some action associated with that on the matter of socially responsible investment board for the university and specific question of divestment from Burma. Next March 13th at 7:30 at the Press House Chapel, if I'm reading it right, there's a talk by two personal friends, Constancio Pinto and Matthew Jardine, on the struggle for an independent East Timor. Constancio was...
With us tonight is a special guest to introduce Noam Chomsky. Bob McChesney is a UW Professor of Journalism. He has written 3 books dealing with media and democracy and hosts a bi-weekly talk show on WORT-FM. Professor McChesney is also active in several media activist groups and is an advisor and board member for a variety of nonprofit publications and broadcast stations. Before entering academia, he was the founding publisher of The Rocket, a Seattle rock magazine that is now the 3rd largest circulation rock magazine in the United States. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bob McChesney.
Well, thank you all for coming out to see me talk tonight. I've prepared a 2-hour address. No, actually, the last time I spoke in this building, it was to one of these community group operations, and I think there were 2 people in attendance. So I think I'm moving up in class here. I don't know how many of you saw yesterday's Cap Times, but there was a interview with Noam Chomsky in it, conducted by John Nichols, and the headline was "Radical Democrat." Well, not a bad headline, "Radical Democrat," referring to Noam Chomsky. And I thought that was an interesting title. What exactly is the difference between a radical Democrat and a Democrat? If you think about it, that's an interesting question. What are the core principles of democracy that Noam Chomsky adheres to that would qualify him as a radical Democrat or as a Democrat? Well, first of all, is the idea that people are capable of governing their own lives. People are capable of governing their own lives. Secondly, is the idea that we should respect individual freedom and the ability of people to live their life to the fullest. Third, a core tenet of democracy is the idea that we should understand the quality of an individual's existence is in direct relation to the quality of their social relations. That as long as anyone is what democracy is all about. It may not be perfect, but it's the best of all possible worlds. In Orwellian newspeak, and that's exactly what this is, capitalism equals democracy. Those policies that serve capital, that serve the wealthy, thereby automatically serve democracy, despite the transparent idiocy of such claims that we see around us every day. Not simply in the United States, but throughout the world. I've seen the statistic quoted. I don't know how accurate it is, but it doesn't stop me from using it. It's too good to pass up. That if you took the 100 wealthiest individuals in the world, the 100 wealthiest individuals who'd probably fit in the first half of this theater, if even that, they would have as much wealth as the 1.5 billion poorest people in the world. 1.5 billion people. That's more people than live in all of the Americas. That's more people than live in Europe. That's 6 times the US population. How can you have a democratic society with that sort of inequality? Moreover, how can the very people pursuing policies to accentuate economic and social inequality claim to do so on behalf of democracy? which is what's happening in the world today. It's a truly Orwellian situation. Fortunately for us, though, tonight we will have a principal opponent of this world, Noam Chomsky, a true Democrat, a radical Democrat only because of the way democracy has been warped in this current culture, in this current environment, a principled and honest man whose core value has always been tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may, without any sacred cows. I think for myself and for many people in this room, and certainly many people around the world, Noam Chomsky has been a teacher. He's probably been the most important teacher I've had, and I think it's true for so many people, of democratic values, of morality, and of intellectual honesty. Specifically for those of us who've chosen life in the academy, or who are intellectuals, he's been a central exemplar of how to behave and conduct ourselves. No one is free. That's a core principle of democracy. And finally, a critical aspect of democracy is the notion of equality. The notion that if one's race, gender, or class prevents them from full participation, a society cannot be democratic. Now, why is it that that's considered radical Democrat, not just Democrat? Why not just Democrat? Well, the reason for that, of course, is that the term Democrat and democracy has been twisted in our culture in an almost Orwellian manner. The status quo of democracy in this country is very far from the ideal. Instead of the principle of one person, one vote being the driving force, we have that as a formality, but in reality the driving principle in our democracy is $1, one vote. And those with the money are those with the most important votes. The most important value we seek to provide in this culture, this democracy, is not to encourage the full participation of individuals in the decision-making process, but rather the most cherished value is to protect private property so it can act as it pleases with minimal social obligation. And in a society where 0.5% of the population has more wealth than the bottom 90% of the population, it's clear that it's a type of democracy that looks awfully goofy by the principles I just mentioned. In our political culture, we see a deteriorating civic culture, a deteriorating physical environment, and a depoliticized, atomized, and demoralized population. The key decisions in our society are made by the few and for the few. Now, what I've just said explains why what Noam Chomsky does is a radical Democrat, not a Democrat, because that sort of democracy is precisely the opposite of what Noam Chomsky stands for. And it's worth noting that the type of democracy that I just referred to that exists today in the United States, of $1, one vote, is largely uncommented upon in our official culture. To our politicians, our pundits, too many of our academics, and certainly our mainstream media, this is democracy. This is